Welcome to week 5 of ALC314, Advertising Designing Desires. We're going to talk about controversial products, and our case is going to be Camel cigarettes. Now, there are a lot of controversial products that are advertised incredibly interestingly, which is a terrible way of saying it, but basically, because they're controversial, they actually move into designs that are quite creative. This could be good or bad, depending on your politics, but depending on your ethics. If you've read the reading this week, you'll discover that the danger of these products is that they actually cause millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of early death. So Camel cigarettes is the one that we're going to look at, because sometimes it's good to focus, and in a way this is what the way that analysis of advertising works best. Focusing on a particular product, working through its industrial structures, and working out what this particular brand is trying to do through its advertising. So Camel cigarettes has been around, as you can see, for over 100 years. Just over, but over 100 years. And they started their campaign very much like a lot of other brands that started in the late 19th century and early 20th century by creating a buzz, which means that they put a bunch of ads out which just said camels are coming, and there's going to be more camels in America than all of the Middle East. So in that way, what they were trying to say was something exciting was appearing. But what if you read the fine print, as you'd see in this ad, it just means that they're going to churn out, the largest manufacturer in the United States is going to turn out millions and millions of cigarettes. But differently than in the past, they were going to make sure that they were highly branded and we knew exactly what the brand was. They weren't generic, they weren't just cigarettes, they were Camel cigarettes with its Turkish blend, with the quality of something attached to it that made it more highly valuable than any other cigarette. And so at that time, 1913, there weren't very many competitors. In fact, there were about 2 major tobacco manufacturers, but also they weren't really well developed. They'd been going for a while, since about the 1860s in terms of brands, but they weren't really developed into national brands or international brands. And Camel represents one of those brands that went international. So in 1913, it goes and makes itself into a clear-cut brand by setting up Camel, which implies something exotic, but Camel also implying something that we would all remember. So as time went on, one of the things about cigarettes is that from the 19th century, people were pretty aware that cigarettes were bad for you. You know, people hacking and coughing after they'd smoked for a while. And generally by the turn of the century, there was enough evidence, actually, turn of the last century, that cigarettes were actually a cause of cancer. This wasn't really fully confirmed, and partly the reason why it wasn't confirmed was that the cigarette manufacturers actually put a lot of health money into making sure that they talked about how cigarettes were really good for other kinds of health concerns, calming the mind, making people thinner. But all of these are kind of mythic notions, but they do identify humans' oral fixations, I suppose, and eating is as much an oral fixation as something like cigarettes. So what Camels did is that they developed this series of ones to differentiate their product. You know, all cigarettes were seen to be a little bit hazardous, and they developed theirs that doctors smoke them more than anyone else. So they went out and did the research for this, but probably also provided, as they did with the entertainment industry, lots of packets, big packets like you get at an airport, of cigarettes to doctors. And just like the pharmaceutical companies that you would have also read about in the Tolan and Frith article for this week, is that they convince doctors to kind of back their own cigarettes. At the time, in the 30s and 40s, doctors were smoking as much as, or close to as much as, the rest of the population, despite their probable awareness that that smoking was incredibly bad for people, causing people to die, early deaths at an incredible rate. The other thing that happened is that Camels also got celebrities, not only doctors, but celebrities involved in smoking. And so what was occurring at that time was a series of ads, and I've just got a still here, actually on the Cloud Deacon site for the unit. You'll be able to look at this more closely. But basically, these ads were shown in before or after films, and in this one, it's a 1949 one, on television as well. This expanded in interesting ways by the 1950s. And by the 1950s, one of the problems that cigarettes had was that they were generally getting restricted as to where they could advertise to a degree, but by the 1960s, in a very big way. Camel, interestingly, created its legitimacy by being the sponsor of television news in the United States. NBC News, National Broadcasting Corporation, one of the biggest television entities of the last century and well into this century as well. And their news caravan was the first kind of evening news structure that existed on television. And like a lot of television at that time, which was the same as radio, it was always sponsorship structure. So it doesn't matter, it could be Pepsodent toothpaste sponsoring some sort of variety hour, it could be Ford Motor Company sponsoring someone else. And you saw variations of these things, particularly in North America, where very major stars were attached to particular companies. So for instance, Bob Hope, who you might know, kind of old and dead now, but was a major star, but appeared on television for 15 or 20 years. It was the Bob Hope Chrysler program. So it was a major car manufacturer that he was attached to. So interestingly, news, which you would think would be, the thing that probably should stay away from cigarettes, considering its incredibly dangerous qualities, was actually sponsored by it. And it gave cigarettes a certain legitimacy. Also, two of the major people in early television that were journalists at that time were obviously smoking Camel cigarettes on air. Edward R. Murrow was one of those. And if you know anything about journalism in the 1950s, he was probably the most powerful and, in terms of opinion, could shift opinion in the United States quite dramatically by what he said. Take a look at the movie that was made by George Clooney about it. By the 1960s, if you look back over here, they started, instead of sponsorships, they moved into spot advertising on television. And they had a series that ran for about 6 or 8 years. This is Camel, which was I'll Walk a Mile for a Camel. And they had a sort of a whistling sort of tune attached to it. Again, I'm not going to show it here, but you can look at it later, where they were kind of trying to just get it into your consciousness the way a jingle would. And the idea was that you go a long way, and all the ads ended with them, with a man usually, smoking a cigarette. And you could see that what was happening with Camel also was shifting away from its notion of a general brand by the 1960s, recognizing that it was going to go for the working male or the outdoor male. Because you'll see that a lot of cigarette advertising, as the negative press came from scientific evidence of how bad cigarettes were for you, how they were the major carcinogen in, right around the world. They gradually moved to showing outdoor scenes, almost always, fresh air and smoking in fresh air. So take a look at that ad and sort of tell me what you think as they're trying to position a cigarette as something a little bit differently in the 1960s. And this is after certainly the Surgeon General in the United States clearly declared that cigarettes should not be on television, and by the 1970s, it wasn't. And it literally, cigarette advertising disappeared from all commercial television, virtually all commercial radio in the UK, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. All of these things happened, And basically, cigarette advertising got sequestered into some theatrical exhibitions. They didn't have the same kind of regulations there because you could regulate the kind of movie that you showed on in a film theater. So you could say, have a restricted 18 plus kind of exhibition, and a cigarette ad would appear there. But even more prominently was probably in magazines. A lot of the magazines from the 1970s and 80s were just filled with cigarette advertising. Over time, though, the pressure on the manufacturers of cigarettes was quite enormous. And one of the problems of the actual product is it kept killing people. So the only way that they could create new demand for their product was actually new people that appeared on the scene. And what Camel did, although they denied it, is that they basically, like most of the other manufacturers of cigarettes, started appealing to children. And Joe Camel, our lovely smooth character here, represents probably the pinnacle of advertising that was looking as if it was a young adult sort of style, but was incredibly appealing to children. In fact, there was some study in about 1993 that said about 91% of people recognized Joe Camel, which rivaled or overwhelmed the idea of Mickey Mouse or a bunch of other cartoon characters. So Joe Camel was incredibly famous for youth. And what also happened was that Camel repositioned itself as a youth kind of brand. As you can see from the 1960s, it was clearly a kind of working man's adult cigarette. That had declined. It wasn't working that well. There were other ads that were showing around too, which is saying, isn't it, in the 1980s and 90s, isn't it difficult to find a good place to smoke, as people were excluded from smoking in their offices. And they would have ads showing people, basically in open window veranda style offices, as if, Camels or other cigarettes were somehow notions of freedom. So a lot of the ads of Camel were notions of defying authority, which appealed to children as they moved into adolescence, roughly the age of 13. Most kids started smoking about the age of 13. And by 14, 15, they were daily smokers. And the manufacturers knew that, and the advertisers knew that. This campaign got into giant trouble, and started in about 1987, at least in the United States, slightly earlier in France. And by 1997, there were so many lawsuits against this campaign that before I think they probably settled in all sorts of ways, but before any decision was made, Reynolds actually pulled the Camel from this Joe Camel from their ads. Now, they kind of disappeared for about 15 years. Camel cigarettes weren't really advertising at all. And of course, a brand can't sustain itself very easily if it doesn't. Not sure why it isn't going to the next screen.